The slap echoed through the marble lobby of a hotel filled with hundreds of wealthy guests, and Grace stood frozen, her cheek burning red under the chandelier light. Catherine, the woman everyone assumed was the future wife of the hotel's owner, was not finished. She called the single mother a gold digger and raised her hand to strike. But before that hand could fall a second time, a voice cut through the silence from the staircase above. The CEO descended the stairs, looked at the mark on Grace's face, and gave one quiet order to his security team: hold her. But the reason Jackson protected her was far more shocking than anyone guessed. Stay until the end to find out. The evening had begun hours before that slap, in the golden hush of the Crown Meridian Hotel in Chicago, where the anniversary gala for the Carter Meridian Group was drawing every investor, banker, and old money family the city had to offer. Chandeliers threw soft light across marble floors, and waiters moved between clusters of tailored suits and diamond earrings like they were part of the architecture. Grace Madison was not one of the guests. She had taken a temporary serving shift because the bills would not wait, and pride had never been something she could afford to eat. She had not always carried trays through crowded ballrooms. Years earlier, Grace built a career as a contract auditor, the kind of quiet, exacting work that kept corporations honest without anyone noticing her name. A string of hard years, a lost position, and a family crisis had unraveled that life, but the mind behind it had never dulled. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She was a woman between chapters, and she knew the difference. While setting up a reception table near the finance department's private booth, Grace noticed a payment sheet someone had dropped near the linens. A single line caught her attention out of habit rather than curiosity. A consulting fee of $480,000, listed twice under two different company names. It was the kind of duplication that meant nothing to most people and everything to someone trained to read a ledger. Her instincts, built over years of chasing discrepancies for a living, would not let the detail go. Before she could set the paper down, Connor Wyatt appeared beside her and snatched it from her hand with a sharpness that startled her. "You were hired to serve," he said, his voice flat and cold, "not to read." Grace apologized and stepped back, keeping her expression neutral even as her pulse quickened. She had spent enough years in boardrooms to recognize the particular panic of a man protecting a number he did not want anyone to see. Connor did not return to his conversation right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and typed a short, urgent message to Catherine Hayes. A temporary worker saw the payment sheet. He hit send before Grace had even reached the next table. And from that moment forward, the evening stopped being a simple shift and became something far more dangerous. Grace had no idea that a single glance at a piece of paper had just placed her inside a conspiracy that had been quietly bleeding the Carter Meridian Group for years. She only knew that the man who had grabbed the sheet from her hand had looked at her the way people look at witnesses, not employees. She finished refilling the water glasses at table 9 and told herself it was nothing. But somewhere across the ballroom, a woman in an emerald gown was already reading the message on her phone, and her expression had gone very still. Grace did not know Catherine Hayes by sight yet, only by the low hum of gossip that trailed her through every event like perfume. She had heard the name mentioned twice already that night, always in the same breathless tone reserved for women who were expected to marry well. None of it mattered to Grace. She had a shift to finish, a daughter waiting at home with a neighbor who charged by the hour, and a rent payment due in 4 days. Whatever quiet storm was gathering across the room, she assumed it had nothing to do with her. She was wrong, and somewhere deep in the part of her mind that had once caught fraud for a living, a small familiar unease had already begun to stir. Catherine Hayes arrived at the gala in a gown that cost more than most people's cars, and the photographers who lined the entrance treated her like she was already the future mistress of the Carter Meridian Empire. She smiled for every camera, let her hand rest just long enough on the arm of whichever executive stood nearest, and allowed the whispers about her and Jackson Carter to grow louder with each passing month. It was a story she had built with patience, the way other people built companies. The truth beneath the gossip was far less romantic. Years earlier, both families had quietly hoped that Catherine and Jackson would marry, a union that would tie two old fortunes together in the way old fortunes like to be tied. Jackson had never agreed to it, not fully, not in the way Catherine needed him to. During the 6 months he spent overseas managing a difficult expansion project, Catherine had used his absence to plant herself deeper into the company's social fabric, until half the city assumed the engagement was simply a matter of time. She found Grace near the service corridor less than 20 minutes after Connor's message arrived. At first, Catherine was almost pleasant, asking in a light, curious tone what exactly Grace had seen on the payment sheet. Grace, unwilling to lie and unable to see any reason to, answered honestly. She said she had noticed a duplicate line item, nothing more, and that she had no interest in company matters that were not her concern. It should have been reassuring. Instead, the way Grace described the entry, the ease with which she used terms like cost code and duplicate vendor identifier, told Catherine exactly what kind of woman she was dealing with. This was not a confused server who had glanced at a page by accident. This was someone who understood exactly what she had seen. Fear, dressed as authority, moved quickly. Catherine found the event manager and demanded that Grace be removed from her shift immediately, citing a vague complaint about professionalism. Grace did not argue. She had learned long ago that dignity mattered more than winning small, unwinnable fights. She unclipped her staff badge, thanked the manager, and turned to leave through the main lobby. She had nearly reached the doors when a young server jogged up behind her, holding out a phone Grace had left near the linen station. Grace thanked him and slipped it into her bag without breaking stride. From across the room, Catherine watched the exchange and chose, deliberately, to see something else entirely. In her mind, or perhaps only in the story she needed to tell, Grace had just been handed something she was never supposed to have. "Stop her," Catherine called out, her voice carrying over the string quartet and the low murmur of champagne conversations. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and in that single moment the gala shifted from celebration to spectacle. Catherine crossed the lobby with the kind of purposeful stride that drew eyes even before she opened her mouth. She stopped in front of Grace and demanded, loud enough for the nearest cluster of gs to hear, that Grace open her bag for inspection. Grace refused. She had done nothing wrong, and she was not about to let a stranger paw through her belongings on a whim dressed up as authority. Her calm only sharpened Catherine's anger. Unable to produce a reason, Catherine reached for something crueler instead. She suggested, loudly enough for a dozen guests to hear, that Grace made a habit of cozying up to wealthy men for money. A few phones rose into the air, red recording lights blinking to life. "If you believe I have taken something," Grace said evenly, "call security and let them look." The steadiness in her voice landed harder than any accusation could have. Catherine felt the crowd's attention tilt, almost imperceptibly, away from her and toward the composed woman in the plain black uniform. It was not a feeling she knew how to lose gracefully. Behind her, Connor watched with a stillness that was its own kind of signal. He said nothing, but the look he gave Catherine carried an unmistakable pressure, a reminder of exactly what was at stake if this went the wrong way. Catherine snapped. She lunged forward and tore the bag from Grace's shoulder before anyone could stop her. As it hit the floor, a small silver drive skittered across the marble and came to rest near a startled guest's shoe. Grace stared at it with genuine confusion. She had never seen the device before in her life. Connor stepped forward immediately, his voice pitched for the crowd rather than for accuracy. "That drive contains internal company data," he announced, and the words landed exactly as he intended, transforming a confused server into a suspected thief in the span of one sentence. Grace understood with a cold clarity that she had just walked into a trap someone else had built weeks in advance. Catherine seized the moment. She called Grace a thief, then, twisting the knife further, called her a desperate single mother trying to claw her way into a life she had never earned. "Check the cameras," Grace said quietly. "Every angle of this lobby is recorded." It was a simple sentence, but it landed like a verdict. Connor's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he smoothed it away. Catherine did not wait for cameras. She raised her hand and struck Grace across the face, the sound cutting through the ballroom like a shot. For a long moment, nobody moved. The music from the string quartet faltered and died. Grace stood perfectly still, her cheek burning, a thin red mark rising beneath her eye, and said nothing at all. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap itself, the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone present suddenly understands they have witnessed something they cannot unsee. Catherine's hand rose again. Enough. The word cut through the lobby like a blade, calm and absolute. Every head turned toward the grand staircase, where Jackson Carter had just appeared, his gaze already fixed on the mark rising across Grace's face. Jackson did not rush down the stairs, and he did not raise his voice. He came down slowly, each step deliberate, the way a man moves when he has already decided how the next few minutes will go. The crowd parted without being asked to. He reached Grace first. He did not touch her, only leaned in slightly and asked in a tone far gentler than anyone in that lobby had heard from him in years whether she needed medical attention. Grace, still stunned, shook her head. Only then did Jackson turn to Catherine. "Who gave you the right to strike an employee in my hotel?" he asked. The question was quiet, but it carried through the entire room. Catherine's expression shifted instantly, fear dressed up as affection. She reached for his arm and insisted, her voice climbing toward panic, that Grace had stolen confidential company data, that she had only been protecting him. Jackson stepped to the side, out of her reach, and said nothing. The small, deliberate distance said everything Catherine needed to hear. He turned to his head of security. "Jason, examine the drive. Now." Catherine tried to step away from the gathering crowd, but Jackson's next words stopped her before she reached the doors. "Miss Hayes does not leave this lobby until legal counsel and the appropriate authorities arrive," he said, his tone even. "Keep a respectful distance. She is not to be harmed in any way." Two security officers moved to block the exit, their posture calm but unmistakably firm. This was not punishment delivered in anger. It was containment ordered with the same precision Jackson brought to every decision in his company, a way of ensuring the truth could be established before anyone disappeared from the room. Catherine's composure finally broke. She shouted that Jackson was humiliating the woman who was supposed to be his future wife in front of half the city. "You were never that woman," Jackson said. The lobby went utterly silent. Somewhere near the back, a glass touched a tray and the small sound seemed to echo for a full second. But the larger surprise of the evening had not yet arrived. Jackson turned back to Grace, studying her with an expression that had shifted from concern into something closer to recognition. "Miss Madison," he said slowly, "we have met before." Grace blinked at him, certain she had misheard. She had never in her entire life been introduced to Jackson Carter. She had barely worked a handful of shifts inside his company's properties, and always from the far edges of events like this one, invisible in the way service staff were trained to be invisible. And yet the certainty in his voice told her this was not a mistake, and not a line meant to diffuse the tension in the room. Something from her past, something she had believed long buried, had just resurfaced in front of 300 witnesses. 3 years earlier, Grace had worked as a contract auditor for an independent consulting firm, the kind of quiet, thankless work that rarely earned recognition even when it saved a company millions. During a routine review, she had uncovered a pattern of irregular payments tied to a Carter Meridian development called Meridian Lakes, a series of transactions that did not add up no matter how many times she checked them. She wrote a report and flagged it for escalation, following every procedure her firm required. That report never reached Jackson. Somewhere between her desk and his, a mid-level manager had intercepted it, buried it in an internal file, and quietly informed the consulting firm that the client no longer felt Grace was a good fit for their account. Weeks later, she was let go, her name attached to a vague, unfair note about professionalism that followed her through 2 failed job searches afterward. Jackson had only learned of her existence a few weeks earlier, when a new internal audit stumbled onto her old report buried deep in an archived server. Something about the precision of it, the clean logic of a warning nobody had listened to, stayed with him. He had quietly instructed his legal team to locate the woman who wrote it. No one had told him she was working shifts inside his own hotel. 3 years ago, Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the crowd still watching, "Did you write a report on the Meridian Lakes development?" Grace went very still. That report had cost her a career she loved and had taken years to rebuild any confidence from. Behind the gathered crowd, Connor began edging backward, inch by inch, toward the exit. Jason noticed immediately and signaled 2 officers to close the distance. A preliminary scan of the drive that had fallen from Grace's bag revealed exactly what Jackson suspected. The files on it were financial documents, fabricated, and time-stamped only hours before the gala began. Someone had built the evidence to frame Grace before she ever set foot in the lobby. Jackson's next order was immediate and absolute. He instructed his technology team to suspend Connor Wyatt's system access without delay, cutting him off from every account, every server, every file he might otherwise have raced to erase. Catherine's composure, already fragile, began to crumble entirely. She realized in that moment that Jackson had not simply flown home for an anniversary gala. He had returned to Chicago because the numbers she and Connor had spent years hiding were finally being unearthed, one buried report at a time, and the woman standing beside her with a red mark still rising on her cheek was the person who had seen it first, 3 years before anyone else had bothered to look. The music never resumed that night. Somewhere in the back of the lobby, a valet quietly ushered confused guests toward the exit, while the people who mattered most to the story remained exactly where they stood, waiting to see what Jackson would do next. Jackson moved everyone who mattered out of the lobby and into a private security office one floor below, away from the remaining guests and the last of the recording phones. Grace, Catherine, Connor, and Jason gathered around a bank of monitors while an officer pulled the footage from the last hour. The first clip settled the matter of the drive almost instantly. It showed Connor's assistant approaching the exact spot where Grace had set down her bag, glancing around briefly and slipping a small silver object inside before walking away as though nothing had happened. Grace's innocence was, for that piece of the evening at least, no longer in question. Catherine denied any involvement immediately, her voice tight and defensive. Jackson did not accept or dismiss the denial outright. He simply asked Jason to keep working. A second clip surfaced minutes later, showing Catherine speaking closely with Connor near the coat check, well before Grace had ever been stopped. The footage had no sound, which left the conversation open to interpretation rather than proof. Catherine seized on the gap immediately. She insisted Connor had acted entirely on his own, and that she had simply misunderstood the situation with Grace in the heat of the moment. Grace could have pushed back. She had every reason to. Instead, she said only what the evidence actually supported. "The footage proves I didn't take anything," she said. "Whatever else happened here isn't something I need to be part of." She turned to leave, ready to collect her coat and go home to her daughter, when Jackson stopped her with an offer that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He asked if she would be willing to review the financial documents his internal audit team had uncovered, the ones connected to Meridian Lakes and to whatever pattern Connor had built since. Grace declined any payment tied to sympathy. She had not survived the last 3 years on anyone's pity, and she was not about to start now. Jackson clarified quickly. He was not offering charity. He was offering a paid independent contract, compensated at the rate her expertise actually warranted, the same rate any outside auditor would command for work this sensitive. The distinction mattered enormously to Grace, and it mattered to the story unfolding around her. This was not a wealthy man rescuing a poor woman out of guilt or attraction. It was a company finally recognizing a skill it had once thrown away and offering to pay for it properly the second time. Grace thought about her daughter, about the rent due in a matter of days, and about the version of herself who had once loved this kind of work more than almost anything else. She agreed to look at the documents on the condition that anything she found would go directly to the legal department, not to Jackson personally, and that she could walk away at any point if the arrangement stopped feeling honest. Jackson agreed without hesitation. Grace spent the following 2 days buried in spreadsheets and vendor files inside a small conference room the legal department had cleared for her, a cup of coffee going cold beside a growing stack of printed statements. Within a few hours, she confirmed what her instincts had told her back in that lobby. The $480,000 consulting fee she had glimpsed on the payment sheet was not an isolated error. It was one thread in a much larger pattern of circular payments running through the company's vendor network. Several of the consulting firms listed as independent contractors, she discovered, shared the same registered address, the same handful of officers, and, in 2 cases, the same fax number no one had bothered to change. Following the trail further, she traced the final destination of the funds to an investment vehicle controlled by the Hayes family. Across 3 years, the amount diverted through the scheme had grown to more than $18 million. The deeper twist, the one that reshaped everything Grace thought she understood about the evening at the gala, was that Catherine had not built this alone. Connor Wyatt had designed the entire structure, layering shell vendors and inflated invoices with the patience of a man who had done this kind of work for a very long time. Catherine's role had been different, but no less essential. She had known about the scheme for years, and had quietly helped Connor route payments through vendors connected to her own family's holdings, lending the fraud a legitimacy it could never have earned on its own. In exchange, Connor had spent those same years helping Catherine tighten her grip on influence inside Carter Meridian, applying pressure wherever he could to steer Jackson toward the kind of marriage that would cement both families' positions for a generation. Grace found something even more unsettling buried in the older files. Her report from 3 years earlier had come remarkably close to exposing the entire scheme while it was still in its infancy, before it had metastasized into anything close to $18 million. If that report had ever reached Jackson's desk, the years of quiet theft that followed might never have happened at all. When she brought her findings to Jackson, laying out the timeline in plain, careful language, she watched something settle heavily in his expression. He understood in that moment that his own company had indirectly cost Grace her career for the crime of being right 3 years too early. He apologized and meant it. Grace did not need the apology and told him so gently. "You don't have to apologize for everyone who let this happen," she said. "You just have to fix the system that allowed it to happen in the first place." It was not a grand statement, not the kind of line built for effect. It was simply true, and Jackson recognized, listening to her say it, that he was talking to someone whose judgment he had no reason to doubt. Respect, quiet and unhurried, began to settle into the space where suspicion had briefly lived. Outside the conference room window, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the $18 million quietly changing hands somewhere inside its towers, and to the two people now determined to trace every last one. Catherine cooperated with lawyers and investigators through the proper process, at least on the surface, but before the full findings could be made public, the Hayes family's public relations team quietly began shaping a different narrative. They painted Grace as a struggling employee who had set her sights on a wealthy man and used the chaos at the gala to humiliate Catherine on purpose, positioning herself as a victim to gain sympathy and, eventually, access to money she had never earned. A photograph of Jackson standing close to Grace during the gala began circulating widely, stripped of any context. Within days, Grace found herself the subject of speculation from people who had never met her and knew nothing about the years she had spent rebuilding a career from almost nothing. Jackson wanted the company to respond immediately, to defend her publicly and forcefully. Grace stopped him before he could. She did not want to become the woman the CEO had rescued, a story shaped entirely around Jackson's decisions rather than her own competence. She asked him to release the evidence, the documents, the timeline, the facts that could stand on their own, and to leave her personal life out of it entirely. Jackson agreed, and something in their working relationship shifted permanently in that moment. He had spent most of his career making decisions and expecting people to follow them. With Grace, for perhaps the first time, he found himself listening first and deciding second. During an emergency meeting of the board, Connor made one final, desperate move. He produced a document suggesting that Jackson himself had known about the irregular transactions for months and had chosen to look the other way, a claim that, if believed, could cost Jackson his position entirely. Catherine watched with something close to relief, certain the tables had finally turned back in her favor. Grace studied the document for less than a minute before she found the flaw hiding inside it. The date stamped across the header did not match the version of the accounting software the company had been using at that point in time, a detail so small most people in that room would never have noticed it. The document had been fabricated, and fabricated recently. She explained her reasoning calmly, without theatrics, walking the board through exactly why the timeline could not hold. It was the kind of quiet, methodical explanation that left no room for argument, the same skill that had once cost her a job and was now in this room worth more than anyone at the table had expected. Several board members exchanged glances, the shift in the room almost physical, as the balance of trust moved decisively away from Connor and toward the woman in the plain black blazer, sitting where a guest would normally sit. Jackson said nothing during her explanation, watching instead, and later admitted to himself that he had never seen anyone dismantle a lie with so little effort or malice. There was no triumph in her voice, only precision, and somehow that made the moment land even harder for everyone watching. Connor's face went pale as the room absorbed what Grace had just proven. Catherine's brief flicker of relief collapsed just as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold understanding that the one weapon she had been counting on had just been taken out of her hands, in front of the entire board, by the same woman she had struck across the face only days earlier. The following week, Grace stood before the full board and an outside legal counsel and laid out the entire chain of evidence in plain, unhurried language. She did not present herself as some extraordinary genius uncovering secrets beyond anyone's reach. She simply connected data that belonged squarely within her area of expertise, the same way she had connected numbers for a living years before anyone in that room had ever heard her name. She walked them through the duplicate $480,000 consulting fee that had started everything. She showed how the shell vendors linked back to one another through shared addresses and shared officers. She laid out how her own report from 3 years earlier had been intercepted and buried before it ever reached Jackson's desk. She explained how the drive planted in her bag at the gala had been assembled specifically to make her look like a thief. And she demonstrated, point by careful point, that the document accusing Jackson of prior knowledge had been created well after the date printed on its header. Finally, Jason presented the last piece. Digital records confirmed that Connor had contacted Catherine within minutes of Grace noticing the payment sheet at the gala, a message trail that made the coordination between them impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Connor understood, watching the room's expression harden around him, that there was no path left forward. He tried, in a last scramble for self-preservation, to shift the full weight of responsibility onto Catherine alone. Catherine erupted, furious and cornered, and in her anger let slip a detail she had never intended to reveal. She admitted, without meaning to, that she had known about Grace's original report from 3 years earlier, long before anyone had told her its contents. The room went silent. That single admission confirmed what everyone in the room had suspected but could not yet prove. Catherine had known about the scheme and about Grace's role in nearly exposing it for far longer than she had ever claimed. Jackson did not celebrate the moment, and he did not raise his voice. He simply turned to legal counsel and instructed them to forward the complete file to the appropriate investigators without delay, and announced, calmly and without a trace of satisfaction, that both Catherine and Connor were suspended from any involvement in company affairs until the matter had run its full course. There was no vengeance in the decision, only order restored through evidence and process rather than through power or anger. Grace, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, felt something settle inside her that she had not expected to feel again after 3 long years, the simple, unglamorous relief of being believed. Outside counsel began drafting the formal referral before the meeting had even fully adjourned, and members of the board who had spent the last hour in stunned silence started asking practical questions about vendor contracts, about how deep the damage actually ran, and about what safeguards would prevent anything like this from happening again. Jackson answered each question directly, without deflecting blame or softening the scope of what had occurred, and more than one board member later remarked privately that they had never seen him speak with such plain, unguarded honesty. Catherine was escorted from the building by 2 members of the legal team rather than by security, a small distinction Jackson had insisted upon even in the middle of everything else. A final, quiet act of restraint from a man who had every reason to want the moment to feel harsher than it did. Connor left separately, several minutes later, saying nothing to anyone as he passed through the lobby where the entire story had first begun to unravel days earlier. A few weeks later, Carter Meridian released the initial findings of its internal audit to the public, and Grace's name was formally cleared of every accusation Catherine had thrown at her that night in the lobby. The story that followed in the press had little to do with scandal and everything to do with a fraud scheme finally coming apart in the light. Jackson asked to meet her, not in a boardroom or a glass-walled office, but at a modest coffee shop a few blocks from her apartment, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu. He set an envelope on the table between them. Grace assumed it was a settlement, some tidy sum meant to close the chapter quietly. Instead, inside was a formal offer for a newly created position, Director of Ethics and Contract Integrity, leading an independent oversight unit that would report directly to the board's audit committee rather than to Jackson himself. The salary was fair, generous even, but not extravagant in a way that would have felt like charity. What mattered more to Grace was the authority attached to it. She would build her own team, set her own standards, and answer to a structure designed specifically to keep her independent from the very executives she might one day need to investigate. 3 years ago, Jackson said, a broken system punished you for telling the truth. I want to build one where the truth is protected instead. Grace did not accept immediately. She studied him for a long moment before asking the question that mattered most to her. And if one day I'm investigating you? Jackson smiled, the first easy smile she had seen from him since the night of the gala. Then you'd be doing exactly the job I hired you for. Grace accepted the position, not because Jackson had rescued her from anything, and not because of the mark that had long since faded from her cheek. She accepted it because for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her work and judged it on its merit alone, rather than on the circumstances life had handed her. She signed the paperwork that same afternoon, sitting across from Jackson with 2 cooling cups of coffee between them, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could easily remember. It was not relief exactly, and it was not vindication either, though both were somewhere inside it. It was closer to recognition, the quiet, unhurried sense of finally being seen for exactly who she had always been, long before anyone in that lobby had bothered to look closely enough to notice. 6 months passed. Carter Meridian recovered a substantial portion of the money that had quietly disappeared over the years, and overhauled its vendor oversight process from the ground up, closing the very gaps that had once let Connor's scheme thrive undetected. Connor faced formal legal proceedings tied to years of financial fraud. Catherine, too, answered for the parts of the scheme the evidence tied directly to her, while the assault in the lobby that night was addressed separately, through its own legal process entirely apart from the fraud case. Grace now led a small, independent audit team with real authority behind it, the kind she had never been given in her earlier career. Her days were quieter than that first chaotic night at the gala, filled with spreadsheets and vendor reviews rather than crowded ballrooms, and she found she preferred it that way. One afternoon, after picking her daughter up from school, Grace ran into Jackson near the entrance of her building. The moment was brief and unremarkable, nothing more than a small girl clutching her mother's hand while two adults exchanged a few easy words on the sidewalk. Jackson and Grace had settled slowly and without pressure into something that looked like friendship, the kind that occasionally lingered a beat too long over a shared laugh. Neither of them rushed to name it anything more than that. "Would you have dinner with me this weekend?" Jackson asked. "Is this a business meeting?" Grace asked, a small smile pulling at her mouth. "No." "Are you sure?" "For the first time in my life," he said, "completely sure." Grace laughed and agreed. The story closed on Grace walking out of the Carter Meridian building under a clear evening sky. 6 months earlier, she had walked through those same doors in a uniform struck across the face by a wealthy woman in front of a room full of strangers. Now she walked out on her own terms, a career rebuilt not on pity but on competence, self-respect, and a truth she had once paid dearly to protect. Grace Madison never asked for revenge. She never asked to be rescued either. All she ever wanted was for the truth to matter as much as it should have mattered 3 years earlier, when a single honest report cost her everything and nobody in power bothered to notice. What finally changed was not luck, and it was not romance. It was one person choosing to look past a uniform and see the competence underneath it. If this story reminded you that quiet honesty is never wasted, even when the world seems determined to overlook it, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Stories like Grace's exist because ordinary people keep telling the truth, even when no one is watching yet.